November 1945. The sun hangs low over the Texas desert. The air is sharp with dust and machine oil. On a remote stretch of land near Fort Bliss, a convoy of U.S. Army trucks grinds to a halt. Crates marked "Property of Peenemünde" are unloaded under military guard. From one of the jeeps, a tall, gaunt man steps down, his arm still in a sling, eyes hollow from months spent hiding in the Bavarian Alps. His name, Wernher von Braun. Around him stand 20 scientists once hailed as the architects of Hitler's vengeance weapons. Now they are assets in a new kind of war. Under the glare of the American sun, they sign contracts not of guilt or pardon, but of silence and service. Behind barbed wire, the lines between enemy and employee blur. Far away in Nuremberg, judges prepare to sentence men for war crimes. Here in Texas, another verdict is being written, one not by judges, but by generals. Before the world demanded justice, America had already chosen utility. The Second World War had ended in thunder and ash. By May 1945, Europe was a continent of ruins, divided among victors who no longer trusted one another. The Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany, uncovering evidence of crimes and technologies no intelligence report had fully prepared them for. In the northern reaches of the country lay Peenemünde, a shattered coastal complex that had once been the heartbeat of the Third Reich's most secret project, the Vergeltungswaffe II, or V2 rocket. It had rained down on London, Antwerp, and Liège, carrying a ton of explosives at supersonic speed. The weapon had terrified civilians, but it had also proven something no nation could ignore, that a machine built by human hands could breach the edge of space. Among the surrendering Germans were men whose work had made that leap possible. Propulsion engineers, guidance mathematicians, metallurgists, test pilots. Many expected interrogation and perhaps imprisonment. Yet within weeks their fates began to diverge sharply from those of ordinary soldiers. American military intelligence, particularly the U.S. Army Ordnance and the newly formed Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, saw more than guilt in these specialists. They saw an opportunity. The United States had fought to destroy Nazi Germany. Now it raced to harvest its knowledge before the Soviet Union did the same. In the chaos of occupation, teams of officers from the Technical Industrial Intelligence Committee scoured laboratories, tunnels, and paper trails. Operation Eclipse and Project Safe Haven missions seized documents by the ton, blueprints for jet engines, guidance gyros, and radar systems stuffed into crates. Somewhere near the Harz Mountains, a smaller, more secret effort took form. It would be called Operation Overcast at first, a temporary program to interview captured scientists. The interviews, however, led not to prison cells but to visas. Wernher von Braun and his core Peenemünde staff surrendered deliberately to the Americans in early May 1945, carrying the fragments of their work, technical notebooks, film reels, and the burned remains of rocket components. Von Braun's arm was in a sling after a car crash during their flight south. His face was gaunt but defiant. To the Americans who debriefed him, he offered something few could: a complete understanding of how to build a ballistic missile from the ground up. Major Robert Staver, chief of the rocket branch at the U.S. Army Ordnance, recognized the value immediately. He compiled the first list of names, scientists and engineers to be extracted from the rubble before Soviet troops reached them. In July, Operation Overcast became Operation Paperclip, named for the paperclips used to attach new, sanitized employment records to the Germans' files. Each profile was examined by the War Department, the State Department, and the Army's Counterintelligence Corps. On paper, none were supposed to have been active members of the Nazi Party or implicated in war crimes. In reality, many had served willingly under the SS hierarchy. Their new identities erased those affiliations in the interest of expedience. The Cold War had not yet been declared, but the logic that would drive it was already shaping policy. Knowledge meant survival. By late 1945, the first groups arrived in the United States under strict secrecy. They were taken to Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, where V2 parts recovered from Germany were reassembled for testing. The scientists worked under military supervision, wearing civilian clothes but confined within guarded perimeters. For them, it was a paradoxical exile, freedom purchased by silence. They could send letters home only through censors. Their families remained stranded in the British zone. Across the Atlantic, the world prepared for justice. The Nuremberg trials opened that November, displaying the machinery of Nazi aggression in full view of the public. Photographs of the rocket program's slave labor tunnels at Mittelwerk, where thousands of concentration camp prisoners had died constructing V-2 shells, appeared in court exhibits. Yet few outside high command knew that some of the program's architects were already working for the United States. The moral line between prosecution and recruitment had blurred in the smoke of victory. For American commanders, the calculus seemed clear. The Soviet Union was consolidating control over Eastern Europe, and reports suggested that Soviet teams were stripping entire factories from Germany, shipping them east to re-establish production under Russian supervision. If Moscow acquired the same rocket expertise, it could threaten the Atlantic in a decade or sooner. The United States could not afford delay. A classified memo from the War Department described the purpose plainly: to exploit for military and civilian purposes the German specialists who are deemed of exceptional merit. The word exploit carried no moral hesitation. By the end of that year, approximately 120 German scientists and engineers had been integrated into the American military research apparatus. They were scattered among bases, laboratories, and arsenals: Fort Bliss, Wright Field, Aberdeen Proving Ground. Many continued to study the very weapon that had devastated Europe, now stripped of its insignia and repainted with white stars. America's technical inheritance from its former enemy had begun. The world had changed in months. The war that ended with unconditional surrender was giving birth to an age of conditional morality. What began as an act of military intelligence was about to evolve into a policy of national science. The file-stamped secret told one story. History, unfolding quietly in the New Mexican desert, was writing another. By early 1946, Operation Paperclip had moved beyond a wartime improvisation. It had become a bureaucratic machine. In Washington, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, formalized the recruitment process, coordinating between the War Department, the State Department, and the Army's Counterintelligence Corps. Dozens of subcommittees drafted memos defining how much past loyalty could be ignored in exchange for present utility. The result was a quiet rewriting of post-war morality, line by line inside government files. Political clearance forms were altered, employment histories retyped. A paperclip attached to each sanitized dossier signaled approval for importation to the United States. The public knew nothing of this network. Officially, Germany's scientists were still under Allied control, forbidden to work in armament research. Unofficially, both Washington and Moscow were racing to secure as many as possible before the Iron Curtain solidified. The Soviets launched their own effort, Operation Osoaviakhim, in October 1946, forcibly relocating more than 2,000 German specialists from the Soviet zone to research centers near Moscow. Entire families were taken in the night, their workshops packed onto trains. In response, American urgency turned into strategy. Intelligence officers argued that each unclaimed German expert was a potential Soviet gain. At the heart of this scramble lay the V-2 rocket. To most Americans, it was still a weapon of terror. To the Army Ordnance Department, it was an engineering blueprint for the future. At White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, captured V-2s were reassembled from broken parts under von Braun's supervision. The desert sky that once knew only artillery smoke now carried the first controlled echoes of spaceflight. In April 1946, the U.S. Army launched V-2 No. 2 from White Sands, reaching over 100 kilometers in altitude. Photographs from onboard cameras showed the curvature of the Earth, an image both triumphant and unsettling. Each test blurred the boundary between wartime exploitation and scientific ambition. Inside the War Department, ethical debate persisted. The State Department initially opposed Paperclip, citing the Potsdam Agreement's denazification principles. Yet the newly emerging Cold War reordered priorities. In January 1947, President Truman authorized Paperclip's continuation under one condition: no individual active in Nazi activities could be employed. The clause was immediately circumvented by revised security summaries. Memberships in the SS were reclassified as nominal. Nazi Party affiliations labeled necessary for employment. Within months, the restriction became an administrative formality. While the scientists adjusted to life in America, they remained isolated. Fort Bliss housed them in fenced compounds with curfews and restricted movement. Interpreters mediated daily communication with U.S. officers. Wives and children, once relocated, lived under supervision. Still, conditions were far from punishment. The Germans were given laboratories, machine shops, and the materials to rebuild the tools of their trade. They published internal reports under Army logos and attended controlled lectures on American industrial practices. Behind guarded gates, a small pocket of German engineering culture had taken root in the Southwest. The American soldiers who worked alongside them often felt conflicted. Many had fought in Europe, losing friends to V-2 bombardments. Now they found themselves assisting the very men who had designed those missiles. Yet curiosity slowly outweighed resentment. The scientists' meticulous methods, precise documentation, redundant testing, mathematical discipline, impressed their hosts. Over time, suspicion turned into professional respect. Rocketry, it seemed, spoke a universal language. Elsewhere, the scope of Paperclip expanded beyond rocketry. Aerodynamicists from Messerschmitt and Heinkel joined. U.S. Air Force research at Wright-Patterson Field. Medical, researchers from Luftwaffe Institute studied high-altitude physiology for the newly independent U.S. Air Force School of Aviation Medicine. Metallurgists and chemists fed data into the early jet and atomic programs. What began as a small experiment with 118 scientists soon exceeded 1,600 individuals across dozens of disciplines. Each carried a shadowed past, yet their knowledge propelled the nation's technological momentum forward. By the late 1940s, the geopolitical temperature rose. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The following year, it tested captured V-2 derivatives under Sergei Korolev's direction. The arms race was no longer theoretical. Washington doubled down on the expertise hidden within its military labs. At Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, von Braun's group, transferred from Fort Bliss, began designing intermediate-range ballistic missiles. Their new project, Redstone, was the direct descendant of the V-2, but longer-ranged, more reliable, and capable of carrying nuclear payloads. The program signified America's transformation from a nation of wartime engineers to a permanent military-industrial power. Yet the secrecy surrounding Paperclip persisted. Journalists occasionally caught fragments of the story, but official denials and classified seals kept details buried. For every headline celebrating a successful missile test, there were hundreds of pages hidden from public scrutiny, personnel files, security briefings, ethics waivers. Beneath the patriotic rhetoric of progress, an unresolved question deepened. Had victory required adopting part of what had been defeated? By 1950, as the Korean War erupted and the Cold War hardened into open rivalry, the answer seemed less moral than mathematical. American superiority in missiles, jets, and nuclear delivery systems depended on the knowledge of men who had once served Hitler. The paradox had become policy, embedded in the budgets and laboratories of a new era. The desert wind that had carried the first V-2 smoke now swept across launch pads crowded with American flags and German blueprints. Operation Paperclip was no longer a secret rescue mission. It was the foundation of an empire of technology. For the men who had once worn the insignia of the Reich, America was both refuge and reckoning. In the heat of the Texas desert and the quiet humidity of Alabama, the engineers of Peenemünde lived in a suspended state of history, neither prisoners nor free citizens. They woke to the sound of distant artillery tests instead of air raid sirens. They dined in mess halls guarded by soldiers who had fought against them. Their wives learned English from military pamphlets. Their children played under flags whose language they barely understood. Letters home passed through layers of censorship, each line inspected for loyalty. Yet the monotony of exile gave birth to purpose. Work became identity. To draw a new blueprint, to calculate thrust ratios, to stand beside a test stand roaring with fire, these acts made them feel useful again. Beneath every technical report lay a quiet bargain. Redemption through science, not confession. To the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps, the Germans were not symbols of moral conflict but instruments of national necessity. The V-2, once a terror weapon, was now a data platform, a self-contained laboratory that could measure atmospheric pressure, vibration, and stress at the edge of space. At White Sands, launch crews mixed American equipment with German precision. Cameras captured every plume of exhaust. Radar tracked each trajectory. Von Braun's team translated their wartime metrics into English, designing new guidance systems that replaced mechanical gyros with early electronic circuits. Each failure taught something: a cracked fuel line, a destabilized fin, a misfired timer. Out of wreckage rose methodology. Tactical doctrine evolved from these lessons: missile units, telemetry stations, recovery teams, laying the groundwork for an entirely new branch of warfare. In a few short years, what had been vengeance became deterrence. Inside Washington's intelligence community, Paperclip was viewed less as an experiment and more as a weapon in the emerging Cold War. Reports from Europe warned that Soviet forces were stripping entire German research centers, transporting both machinery and personnel to facilities near Moscow and Leningrad. The Americans feared a missile gap before missiles even existed. In Pentagon corridors, the phrase scientific intelligence became as potent as any military code. The Central Intelligence Group, precursor to the CIA, monitored every movement of the Paperclip scientists, while the FBI compiled quiet dossiers in case loyalty ever faltered. Yet the same government that surveilled them also shielded them from public scrutiny. The paradox defined the era. The more valuable the knowledge, the deeper it was hidden. International law blurred against national security. Diplomats debated whether housing former Nazis would erode American credibility abroad, but military officers saw a different calculus. If the Soviets reached orbit first, the moral argument would be irrelevant. Thus, each launch at White Sands was as much a message to Moscow as an experiment in propulsion. Science had become espionage by other means. Among American personnel, attitudes toward the Germans shifted slowly. At first they were the enemy scientists, watched with suspicion and occasional hostility. But engineers speak a language of numbers, and shared equations softened resentment. Collaborative problem-solving replaced resentment with respect. Colonel Holger Toftoy, one of Paperclip's strongest advocates, noted that despite their arrogance, the Germans worked with fanatical thoroughness. Younger American officers, eager to learn, began absorbing their methods: structured testing, fault analysis, risk logs, techniques that would later define NASA's operational discipline. Yet beneath this cooperation lay a quiet psychological dissonance. Some Americans wondered whether adopting German efficiency also meant inheriting the mindset that produced it. Could a nation take another's knowledge without absorbing its philosophy? The question lingered like a ghost in every laboratory. Outside the fences, not everyone accepted the bargain. Religious leaders, journalists, and a handful of congressmen questioned the secrecy surrounding Paperclip. They cited reports from the Mittelbau-Dora camp where prisoners had perished assembling rockets under inhuman conditions. How could a democratic nation employ the men who oversaw such factories? The Army's response was procedural. The scientists had been screened and cleared. But documents would later reveal deliberate omissions, SS ranks deleted, statements retyped. Within the State Department, internal memos called the program a moral risk with practical rewards. The language itself became a mirror of the age, pragmatic, cold, and transactional. The ethical debate never reached the public sphere. The Cold War's urgency drowned it out. Yet in private corridors of conscience, the unease persisted. In this crucible of ambition and amnesia, technology advanced with astonishing speed. the V2 data refined into redstone blueprints. The engineers' restricted compounds evolved into open research centers. The same calculations once used to strike London were now applied to test trajectories over the American Southwest. Progress was measurable in kilometers and kilotons, but not in absolution. The Paperclip scientists had become indispensable. Their hands guided the levers of a future none of them could yet see. Around them, America's military and political institutions expanded to absorb this imported genius, translating wartime experience into peacetime industry. But the program's success rested not only on hardware or equations, it depended on how America chose to integrate, manage, and ultimately justify these men and their work. That next story unfolds inside laboratories, boardrooms, and Senate hearings where technology, leadership, and morality collided on an unprecedented scale. When the Peenemünde engineers arrived in America, they brought not only their expertise but also an entire philosophy of experimentation. The V2 had been more than a missile. It was a modular research platform, an elegant combination of chemistry, aerodynamics, and control theory. At White Sands, and later at Redstone Arsenal, this knowledge merged with American industrial capacity. The result was a hybrid culture of engineering that would define Cold War rocketry. The Redstone missile, first tested in 1953, was essentially an Americanized V2, longer, heavier, and more stable. Its innovations were quiet but revolutionary. Redesigned turbopumps, new fuel injectors, improved guidance gyros, and welded monocoque tanks that reduced weight. The same principles later scaled into the Jupiter C and the Saturn I. Each test drew directly on data the Germans had first gathered under Hitler's orders. The irony was unspoken but undeniable. The path to space was paved with the blueprints of a weapon born in tyranny. As the missile program expanded, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, ABMA, became the crucible where imported genius met American bureaucracy. Under Major General Holger Toftoy and later General John Medaris, von Braun's team was given increasing authority, though always under supervision. They built departments, recruited American graduates, and trained technicians who had never seen a V2 in combat. Von Braun, fluent and charismatic, quickly learned how to navigate Washington's corridors. He delivered progress reports with theatrical precision, illustrating each success in the language of both science and patriotism. His leadership style blended German hierarchy with American optimism, a mixture that proved magnetic to politicians and engineers alike. By the mid-1950s, the Redstone team had become the centerpiece of America's missile program. Within this institutional framework, the transformation of enemy experts into national heroes was almost complete. Yet this transformation also exposed tensions. The Air Force and the Navy resented the Army's growing dominance in rocketry. Each branch wanted control of the next generation of missiles. Inter-service rivalry, once bureaucratic, turned strategic. Funding, credit, and prestige were at stake. When the Air Force pushed forward with its Atlas and Thor projects, von Braun's group found itself sidelined despite superior results. The same scientists who had been smuggled into the country for their brilliance were now constrained by politics. But this competition would soon ignite an event that no committee could control. Behind every test stand and launch report lay a shadow of unaddressed history. Many of the engineers had belonged to the Nazi Party. Some had worn SS uniforms. Others had overseen forced labor at Mittelwerk. These facts were buried in classified files during the 1940s. But by the 1950s, the information began to surface. Investigative journalists such as Drew Pearson accused the government of harboring war criminals. Congressional hearings demanded explanations. The Pentagon responded with carefully curated documents showing that each individual had been cleared of major offenses. Few outside the intelligence community realized that those clearances had been rewritten years earlier. When questioned about morality, von Braun offered the same answer he had given in Germany. His loyalty was to science, not politics. To him, rockets were vehicles, not ideologies. It was an argument that resonated in a country now obsessed with technological supremacy. The Cold War's fear of falling behind the Soviets proved stronger than the impulse for retribution. Pragmatism prevailed over principle. As one Senate aide wrote in 1957, "The moral stain is less dangerous than the missile gap." History would not judge so lightly. Public awareness of the German scientists grew gradually, shaped by magazine profiles and television appearances. Von Braun's charm, his ability to explain orbital mechanics in plain English, made him the perfect face for the new space age. He wrote articles for Collier's, appeared on Walt Disney's science programs, and spoke of humanity's destiny among the stars. Few viewers knew that his research lineage traced back to the V-2's deadly legacy. To a nation yearning for optimism, he represented progress without guilt, a bridge between war and wonder. His image helped rebrand the entire Paperclip enterprise as visionary rather than controversial. Inside the scientific community, however, opinions remained divided. Some American researchers resented the prestige the Germans enjoyed. Others admired their discipline and depth. Younger engineers, men like Robert Gilruth, Kurt Debus, and Arthur Rudolph, absorbed both their techniques and their contradictions. The result was a generation of American scientists trained in the structure of German systems engineering. It was this disciplined, iterative approach that would later make Apollo possible. In that sense, Paperclip's influence extended far beyond the individuals. It rewired the very architecture of American innovation. Viewed from a distance, Paperclip was less a single operation and more a reflection of an age. It revealed how modern states justify contradiction in the name of security. The moral language of wartime, justice, punishment, redemption, gave way to the operational language of deterrence, progress, and control. By integrating former enemies into its scientific institutions, the United States declared that victory was not only territorial, but intellectual. Knowledge itself had become a weapon, and whoever controlled it would control the century. This realization transformed the meaning of war's end. The surrender signed in 1945 had not closed the conflict. It had simply changed its battlefield. Laboratories replaced trenches, and engineers became soldiers of ideology. The American flag that now fluttered over test ranges in New Mexico and Alabama was both a symbol of triumph and a question mark over conscience. The rocket flames that split the desert sky illuminated the dawn of the space age, but also cast long shadows behind them. By the mid-1950s, the scientific, political, and moral threads of Paperclip had tightened into a single line of destiny. America possessed the technology to reach space, yet lacked the will to deploy it publicly. That hesitation ended on October 4, 1957, when a metallic sphere named Sputnik crossed the night sky and shattered the illusion of superiority. The race that Paperclip had prepared for was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real time. From this moment forward, every engine test, every policy decision, and every ethical question converged on a single goal: to restore American dominance through the very science once built for the Reich. The climax of this story would not unfold in a courtroom or a battlefield, but on a launch pad. October 4, 1957. The night sky over the Western world changed forever. A faint metallic sphere no larger than a beach ball traced a silent path above the Earth, transmitting a pulsing signal that could be picked up by anyone with a radio receiver. Beep, beep, beep. It was not a weapon. It did not explode. Yet its message shook every capital on the planet. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, and in doing so, had proven that its rockets could reach any point on Earth. For the United States, it was not simply a technological shock. It was a psychological defeat. Within hours, American newspapers declared, "Red Moon over America." Politicians demanded answers. How had the nation that possessed the most advanced laboratories, the largest economy, and the best universities fallen behind? In the Pentagon, the reaction was immediate and grim. If the Soviets could send a satellite into orbit, they could also send a nuclear warhead across the ocean. The missile gap, once an abstraction, had become terrifyingly real. Inside Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, Wernher von Braun and his team watched the news with quiet vindication. For years they had argued that their Jupiter-C rocket could easily launch a satellite, but bureaucracy had restrained them. The Eisenhower administration, cautious and politically wary, had chosen to let a civilian program under the Navy, Project Vanguard, lead America's first orbital attempt. Now Vanguard's delays looked like complacency. Von Braun's group, sidelined but not silent, awaited their moment. The call came within weeks. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, facing national embarrassment, approved a contingency mission under the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. The order was simple: build and launch an American satellite as soon as possible. Von Braun's engineers worked day and night in a frenzy of precision. The Redstone-derived Jupiter-C rocket was repurposed and renamed Juno Freyer. The payload, a small satellite called Explorer-1, was built by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. Coordination was rapid, almost desperate. Military trucks carried components across states in the dead of night. Technicians tested circuits until dawn. At Cape Canaveral, the Florida air was thick with salt and tension. On January 31, 1958, under a star-filled sky, Juno Y thundered upward, cutting a white scar through the darkness. The countdown had been measured in seconds. The significance would last for generations. Minutes later, tracking stations confirmed the signal. Explorer-1 had achieved orbit. For the first time, the United States had joined the Soviet Union in space. Cheers erupted across control rooms. Scientists embraced. Reporters wept openly. A symbolic wound had begun to heal. Yet beyond the celebration, deeper implications unfolded. Explorer-1 carried a Geiger counter-experiment designed by physicist James Van Allen. The data revealed unexpected levels of radiation encircling the planet, the first detection of what became known as the Van Allen belts. It was a discovery that marked America's re-entry into global scientific prestige. Still, the irony was inescapable. The launch that restored American confidence had been powered by the knowledge of men who had once built weapons for Hitler. In Washington, the political machinery accelerated. Congressional hearings followed, not to question morality, but to demand progress. Budgets for missile and space programs tripled. New agencies sprouted overnight: the Advanced Research Projects Agency, RPA, for defense innovation, and within months, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. The very shock of Sputnik had achieved what diplomacy could not: the fusion of military urgency with scientific ambition. Meanwhile, within the corridors of Huntsville, von Braun's engineers transitioned from crisis to vision. They knew that to stay ahead, America needed not just rockets, but a roadmap, a sequence of technological milestones leading from Earth orbit to deep space. Their new focus became Saturn, a powerful multi-stage booster that could carry heavier payloads. The program would inherit the technical DNA of the V2 and Redstone, but its goals were now cosmic, not ballistic. The pace of history quickened. In 1958, while Congress debated budgets, laboratories raced against one another in an invisible war of equations and metal. The Air Force tested Atlas and Thor. The Navy restructured Vanguard. The Army prepared new Redstone variants. Beneath the competition, one truth remained constant. Nearly every breakthrough could trace its lineage back to the German engineers brought under Operation Paperclip. In less than 2 decades, the world had shifted from bomb craters to launch towers, from surrender documents to space capsules. The transformation was unprecedented. The same men who had surrendered to U.S. troops in the Bavarian Alps were now briefing senators on orbital mechanics. The scientists who once built weapons for a totalitarian regime were building instruments of national pride for a democracy. And while America celebrated its new place among the stars, the paradox at the heart of its success deepened. For the Cold War strategists, none of this mattered. What counted were numbers: range, payload, altitude. The Explorer-1 mission proved that American science could recover from humiliation, but it also proved something more enduring: that technological supremacy had become the new face of power. The battlefield of the 1940s had been Europe. The battlefield of the 1950s was the sky itself. As the rocket smoke cleared over Cape Canaveral, von Braun stood quietly near the launch control building, his hands clasped behind his back. He had achieved what he always claimed to desire, to send a rocket beyond the Earth, not to destroy but to explore. Yet even he understood that the victory was complicated. The shadow of Peenemünde still lingered, buried beneath layers of American optimism and Cold War urgency. The world had turned a page, but not without smudges from the last chapter. The success of Explorer 1 was not an ending. It was a beginning. The United States had entered the space age, armed with the knowledge of its former enemies. But the momentum that carried that first satellite into orbit would soon drive a far greater ambition, one that reached beyond the stratosphere toward the moon itself. The launch of Explorer 1 had barely faded from the headlines when Washington realized it needed permanence, not celebration. A single satellite could not secure dominance. It had only announced that a new frontier now existed, and that whoever controlled it would command the future. In July 1958, Congress passed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, officially creating NASA. It was a civilian agency on paper, but its heart pulsed with military urgency. Beneath its emblem of exploration lay the same men and machines that had once belonged to the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. Wernher von Braun and more than 100 of his engineers from Redstone Arsenal were soon transferred to the newly formed Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Their mission was clear: build a rocket powerful enough to lift America beyond fear. Von Braun embraced the transformation with characteristic precision. He replaced Army uniforms with white shirts and narrow ties, drew up organizational charts, and renamed his missile sections as launch vehicle divisions. To the public, it looked like a scientific rebirth. Inside the laboratories, it was evolution, not reinvention. The V-2's architecture still lived in every fuel line and guidance valve. The propulsion design scaled upward into the Saturn series, vast liquid-fueled giants that would one day bear the Apollo spacecraft. Von Braun described the program as a ladder to the stars, but each rung on that ladder was forged from the technology of a darker past. The Cold War accelerated the climb. In 1959, the Soviets stunned the world again by sending Luna 2 to crash onto the moon's surface, the first human-made object to reach another celestial body. The following year, Luna 3 photographed the moon's far side. In Washington, humiliation turned to determination. The Eisenhower administration, and later John F. Kennedy's, concluded that the only way to surpass the Soviets was not by matching them, but by leaping beyond them. That leap became the Apollo program. Von Braun's team, now deeply integrated into NASA's structure, developed the Saturn I booster, a vehicle unlike anything built before in the United States. Its clustered engine configuration, an idea drawn from the Germans' wartime A-9, A-10 intercontinental missile concept, allowed unprecedented thrust. The Saturn I's success in early 1961 proved that America could now send heavy payloads into orbit, paving the way for manned spaceflight. When President Kennedy announced the goal of landing a man on the moon before the decade's end, it was von Braun who knew exactly how to make it happen. He had been designing it for years, only under different flags. Yet within this triumphal momentum, the moral paradox resurfaced. Investigative journalists and Holocaust researchers began publishing evidence that linked certain NASA scientists to the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp, where prisoners had built V-2 rockets under brutal conditions. Names that had been hidden behind bureaucratic euphemisms emerged in print. Arthur Rudolph, one of von Braun's closest colleagues and production director of the V-2 program, was cited in survivor testimonies for overseeing forced laborers who died by the thousands. The revelations threatened to stain NASA's image just as it was becoming the symbol of human aspiration. NASA leadership responded with calculated silence. Official statements emphasized that the agency's purpose was peaceful exploration, not politics. Von Braun himself deflected questions with calm detachment, insisting that he had been a technician under orders. The American public, swept up in the romance of the space race, largely accepted the narrative. The scientists' origins faded into the background as television cameras turned toward the gleaming rockets rising over Cape Canaveral. Inside government, however, unease persisted. Classified briefings acknowledged that the Paperclip scientists were indispensable to NASA's progress. Their knowledge was decades ahead of domestic capability, particularly in high-thrust propulsion and guidance control. To lose them, or to expose their full histories, would risk halting the entire Apollo timetable. Pragmatism once again outweighed morality. Quietly, the Department of Justice postponed further investigations. The Cold War left no room for purges. Meanwhile, the technical achievements mounted. The Saturn I proved reliable, leading to the Saturn IB. And finally, the colossal Saturn Fierce, a three-stage vehicle capable of generating over 7 million pounds of thrust. Its F1 engines, refined through relentless testing at Huntsville and Mississippi, became the most powerful ever built. These machines embodied the union of American resources and German design logic, a fusion so effective that even their creators sometimes struggled to separate where one nation's contribution ended and the other's began. As the 1960s advanced, the paradox deepened into symbolism. The same scientific discipline that had once served a dictatorship now carried humanity toward the moon. For von Braun, it was personal vindication. In 1969, as Apollo 11 prepared for launch, he stood at Kennedy Space Center surrounded by journalists and dignitaries. The man who had once surrendered under the ruins of Germany now represented the pinnacle of American achievement. Cameras captured him smiling as the Saturn V thundered to life. Few paused to consider the journey that had brought him there or the moral debts still unpaid. The transformation was complete. The world that had watched rockets fall in terror now watched them rise in wonder. Operation Paperclip, born in secrecy, had delivered both a technological empire and a philosophical dilemma. America had won the race for the moon, but at the cost of adopting the expertise of those it once condemned. The triumph was genuine, the contradiction permanent. As the dust settled on the moon's surface and astronauts planted the American flag, the story seemed to close with glory. Yet beneath that triumph lay a quieter truth. Progress had not erased the past. It had merely built upon it. The roar of the Saturn V engines echoed not only across space but across history itself, carrying both the promise of exploration and the memory of exploitation. By the early 1970s, the dream that had begun in secrecy beneath the desert sun reached its zenith. The moon landing stood as humanity's greatest technical achievement, and the United States had claimed victory in the most symbolic front of the Cold War. Television audiences across the globe watched astronauts drift weightlessly against the black horizon, their words echoing through the vacuum. One small step for man. For a moment it seemed the past had been purified by progress. Yet beneath the applause, historians, journalists, and ethicists began to re-examine the hidden foundations of this triumph. The lines connecting the ruins of Peenemünde to the laboratories of Huntsville had never truly been erased, only blurred. Operation Paperclip had achieved its stated goal. It had transferred the intellectual capital of Nazi Germany into the industrial machinery of the United States. But the success came with a profound cost, not measured in money, but in moral compromise. Over 1,600 German scientists and engineers had worked under the program between 1945 and 1959. Many had advanced America's missile and space programs. Others contributed to medicine, aviation, and nuclear research. Yet some had been directly involved in wartime atrocities. The United States, which had once promised to prosecute crimes against humanity, had instead reclassified certain perpetrators as specialists. The archives, when later unsealed, revealed the quiet efficiency with which guilt had been redacted from the record. In the years following Apollo 11, public curiosity turned inward. Documentaries and congressional reports probed the moral ambiguity of Paperclip. Survivor testimonies from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp painted a haunting contrast to the gleaming rockets on display in museums. They described starvation, beatings, and corpses hanging from cranes inside the underground tunnels where the V-2 had been built. For them, The sight of a V2 in the Smithsonian was not an artifact of wonder, but a memorial of suffering. Some asked whether the scientists who had overseen those tunnels could ever separate their technical achievement from their moral failure. Government institutions responded cautiously. The Department of Justice opened limited investigations in the late 1970s, targeting a handful of individuals whose wartime records were undeniable. Arthur Rudolph, once celebrated as a key manager of the Saturn V program, was stripped of his U.S. citizenship in 1984 after evidence confirmed his direct involvement in the Dora labor camps. He quietly left the country and returned to Germany, where prosecutors chose not to pursue further charges. His departure symbolized the uneasy truce between justice and pragmatism that had defined Paperclip from the beginning. Wernher von Braun himself avoided prosecution entirely. In the American narrative, he had become the model of redemption, the visionary engineer who turned his genius toward peace. His charisma and optimism made him untouchable in the eyes of many. When he died in 1977, newspapers eulogized him as the architect of the American space age. Few headlines mentioned his SS rank or the slave labor that built his early rockets. The story had been edited long before history could correct it. Meanwhile, the geopolitical rewards of Paperclip extended far beyond the space race. The scientist's influence reshaped military doctrine, industrial production, and academic research. Their methods formalized the American system of large-scale, government-funded technological development, the so-called military-industrial complex. What had begun as an emergency program in 1945 evolved into a permanent alliance between science and the state. The era of the lone inventor was over. In its place rose a world of classified laboratories, test ranges, and billion-dollar contracts. The tools forged in the race for missiles and spaceflight would soon find new purposes: communication satellites, weather forecasting, and intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of ending civilization. By the end of the 20th century, Operation Paperclip had become a cautionary symbol. It represented both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of ethical compromise. For historians, it posed an unsettling question: can civilization advance without carrying its shadows forward? For policymakers, it demonstrated how moral lines bend under the pressure of survival. And for the world at large, it exposed the quiet truth that victory in war does not always bring purity and peace. In the sterile corridors of museums and aerospace centers, visitors still gaze upward at the towering Saturn rockets, magnificent, cold, and silent. Few realize that the blueprint for those engines was once drawn in a bunker beneath Europe's rubble. The American flag painted on the fuselage tells one story. The hands that built it tell another. Between those two narratives lies the real aftermath of Paperclip, an achievement built not just on science, but on the uneasy reconciliation of conscience and ambition. In the decades that followed, the legacy of Operation Paperclip evolved from classified files into public debate. The end of the Cold War opened archives once thought permanently sealed. Documents declassified in the 1990s revealed just how deep the program's reach had been. Not merely a rescue of a few scientists, but a deliberate strategy of technological absorption. The revelations unsettled even seasoned historians. What had long been celebrated as a triumph of American ingenuity was now understood as a calculated act of moral compromise, executed in the name of security. For the first time, the extent of the sanitization became visible. Nazi party memberships erased, SS affiliations omitted, dossiers rewritten with the careful precision of legal surgery, the publication of investigative works like Linda Hunt's Secret Agenda and Annie Jacobson's Operation Paperclip reintroduced the controversy to a new generation. Their findings drew attention not only to the engineers who built rockets, but to the medical researchers, chemists, and psychologists imported under the same program. Some had conducted experiments in concentration camps. Others had advanced eugenics theories that once justified mass sterilizations. The American agencies that had hired them argued that their knowledge could save lives, accelerate medicine, or strengthen defenses. But for many readers, those justifications felt indistinguishable from the logic of the very regime the Allies had defeated. The myth of pure progress began to fracture. Public institutions faced a reckoning of memory. Museums quietly updated exhibits, acknowledging the darker origins of the technology they displayed. University archives cataloged German research grants once erased from faculty records. In Huntsville, local historians debated how to present the city's dual identity. A cradle of spaceflight built by the hands of men who once served a dictatorship. Street names honoring scientists from Peenemünde became subjects of petitions and protests. Some called for their removal. Others argued that history should not be rewritten, only told honestly. In this debate, America confronted a question that transcended time: whether greatness built on compromise can ever be fully celebrated. For the United States government, the moral accounting was slow and partial. The Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations continued to trace former Nazi collaborators living quietly in America, though most were elderly and frail. The effort was more symbolic than judicial, a recognition of unfinished responsibility. Yet even as it sought closure, the nation continued to benefit from the structures those men had built. The missile programs, aerospace corporations, and research laboratories they helped establish had long since become pillars of national power. The tools of war had transformed into engines of commerce. Satellites launched from Cape Canaveral transmitted television, weather forecasts, and global communication, the peaceful offspring of a militarized beginning. By the dawn of the 21st century, the ethical lines drawn in the ashes of 1945 had faded into the complexity of modern geopolitics. The logic of Paperclip, that necessity justifies absorption, echoed in new forms. The recruitment of foreign cyber experts, the repurposing of adversarial technology, the silent bargains struck in the name of innovation. History had not merely recorded Operation Paperclip, it had institutionalized its philosophy. The moral trade-offs once whispered in intelligence offices had become standard features of statecraft in the technological age. Still, among historians, a quieter legacy endures. They remind us that Paperclip was not only a story of rockets and scientists, but of choices, the choices made by democracies under pressure. It revealed how quickly ideals bend when survival is at stake, and how easily secrecy corrodes principle. The documents and test ranges may belong to another century, but the dilemma they represent remains unresolved. Today, when visitors walk through the corridors of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center or gaze upon the black and white footage of Apollo's ascent, they stand at the intersection of two truths. One is luminous, the human capacity to dream beyond the horizon. The other is shadowed, the capacity to justify anything in pursuit of that dream. Operation Paperclip exists precisely between those two extremes. A triumph that carried the echo of surrender, a conquest of space built atop the unfinished reckoning of war. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, historians concluded that Paperclip was neither a scandal nor a success in isolation. It was a mirror, reflecting what nations become when victory demands forgetting. History rarely ends cleanly. It folds, hides, and reappears in new forms, its lessons resurfacing long after the participants have gone. Operation Paperclip was one such fold in time, a chapter that began with surrender and ended with the stars. Its architects never stood trial, yet their work redefined the boundaries of human achievement. They escaped Nuremberg not by running, but by being chosen. The Allies had conquered the Reich, but in doing so, they inherited its knowledge, its contradictions, and its ghosts. For the United States, Paperclip was both a triumph and a confession. It proved that science could win wars, build empires, and touch the heavens, but it also revealed how easily ethics can be negotiated when fear governs policy. In the logic of survival, morality becomes a luxury. The American decision to employ former Nazis was not born of admiration, but of urgency, a belief that the next war, the nuclear war, would be won by whoever mastered the equations first. And so the victors of justice became curators of convenience, preserving the minds they once vowed to judge. Yet history's irony is complete. The same rocket that once carried death across Europe later carried humanity to the moon. The same equations that guided V-2 warheads through London's sky also guided Apollo's descent toward Tranquility Base. It is this paradox that defines the legacy of Paperclip, not as a story of redemption, nor of guilt, but of consequence. When nations choose knowledge over conscience, they gain progress but lose a piece of their reflection. Today, as rockets still rise from Cape Canaveral and satellites orbit silently above, the legacy of those decisions endures, written not only in the records of engineers, but in the moral DNA of modern science itself. Each new frontier reminds us that technology is never neutral. It carries the fingerprints of the age that forged it. Operation Paperclip was never merely about rockets or scientists. It was about what humanity is willing to forget in order to move forward. And as history shows, we often rise highest when we look up, but we understand ourselves only when we dare to look back.